Alexander the Great started in 334 BC his series of conquests that would last for 10 years. He successfully invaded and conquered the First Persian Empire. In 326 BC, he invaded India, but eventually had to stop the campaign because his troops wouldn't carry on. In 323 BC, he died in Babylon at the age of 33. As you can clearly see, the territory covered is even quite extensive for any modern army. The question arises how even a small army could be properly supplied in such a vast area, which brings us to the question of military logistics. Now, logistics is a modern term, but many logistical operations were also performed in Alexander's time. Let's take a look at the simple and a bit modified definition of military logistics. Military logistics is the provision of all means to perform military operations. To put it simply, logistics concerns everything from the arrow for your bow to the food for your stomach and the guy who builds the siege tower. Or in a more sophisticated way, military logistics deals with the determination of demand, acquisition, and distribution of men, supplies, facilities, and services. Now this brings us to the main areas of logistics: the recruitment and reinforcement, the provision and acquisition of supplies, the acquisition and construction of facilities, and the furnishing of services. Note that the common definitions of modern military logistics usually wouldn't include recruitment, but due to Alexander's extensive campaigns and different organizational structure, recruitment is included in our definition. So let's take a look at recruitment. Initially, Alexander fielded around 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. These troops consisted mainly of Macedonians and allies, yet around 5,000 men were mercenaries. To reinforce his armies, Alexander had three possibilities: recruitment in Macedon, hiring mercenary in Greece and in the Balkans, and recruitment in conquered territories. Recruitment in Macedon was probably limited. There are only two known accounts of it. The first one consisted of around 3,000 infantry and the second of about 6,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. These recruitments weren't popular. It is known that the recruitment unit had to use force in order to complete the operation. The main source for reinforcements were mercenaries. Although the initial financial situation only allowed for a small amount of mercenaries, yet after capturing the Persian camp and baggage wagon at Issus, Alexander had a large quantity of gold and silver at his disposal. To recruit mercenaries, special recruitment officers were used at known assembly areas. Greek mercenaries were also used by the Persians. In an early battle, Alexander killed and enslaved a large amount of captured Greek mercenaries who fought on the Persian side, whereas he later recruited such units into his own army. In total, it is estimated that about 60,000 to 100,000 mercenaries served in Alexander's army during his campaigns. There's only limited information available about the recruitment in the conquered Persian territories. One account describes a force of around 30,000 men that were trained and equipped similar to Macedonians. These troops weren't ready until Alexander returned from India, thus they never saw any combat. Now let's take a look how reinforcements were transported. In the first years of his campaign, Alexander had to transfer reinforcements on the land route because he disbanded his fleet due to financial problems. This changed in 332 BC after large parts of the Persian fleet joined Alexander. Usually the reinforcements were transported by sea and marched to their destination. Since Alexander took over the Persian communication network, he could use it to coordinate the reinforcements of his main army. There's only one known account when the reinforcements arrived earlier than the main force. Overall, Alexander's reinforcement had to cover vast distances to reach his army. The longest distance covered was by the Thracian unit that transferred from the Balkans to India. Note that this is not the actual route they took. It should be noted that these long marches had several benefits. They served as a show of force in the newly conquered regions and also provided security operations along the way. Now every army needs supplies, which brings us to the provision and acquisition of supplies. This part is limited in comparison to modern times, and it is important to note that the Macedonian soldier, the Allied soldiers and the mercenaries had to provide their own weapons and armor. But due to the extensive distances and duration of Alexander's campaign, this wasn't always feasible. There is an account of the delivery of around 25,000 sets of armor to India. The three main areas for provision and acquisition of supplies in ancient times dealt with the provision of siege equipment, the construction and transport of ships, and the transportation of loot. The provision of siege equipment was performed by a distinct unit in Alexander's army. We know it had its own commander, Diades of Pella, but we have no information about its size. Diades was in charge of the construction and improvement of siege towers, battering rams, and scaling equipment. If possible, the equipment was transported on ships. Some equipment that would have been impractical to transport was constructed at a location close to the siege itself. We know from the siege of Tyros that some craftsmen were ordered from Cyprus and Phoenicia. The lumber was from Mount Lebanon and delivered to Sidon, where the construction took place. Finally, the equipment was transported with ships to Tyros. Which brings us to the next part, the construction and transportation of ships. Ships and pontoon bridges were used to traverse large rivers and streams. It was important that those ships could be disassembled into smaller parts in order to transport them to the next river. For instance, after crossing the Indus, the ships were disassembled into several parts and then transported to the river Hydaspes. Now comes the part that most of us have at least some experience with. The transportation of loot. Soldiers had to take care of their own loot, which could result in over-encumbrance. So basically Alexander's soldiers face the same problem modern gamers face in Skyrim or Fallout. According to the ancient Greek historian Plutarch, when Alexander reached the mountains of India, he realized his army was too slow. Thus, Alexander burned his baggage wagons, those of his companions, and finally gave orders to burn those of his soldiers too. Which, according to Plutarch, not only solved the problem of over-encumbrance, but also raised the morale of most soldiers. Yet the more important part is about the major spoils of war. Large amounts of silver and gold had to be transported to Minsk in order to finance Alexander's campaign. In order to properly haul these precious metals, a large amount of mules and camels was necessary. Additionally, several thousand troops were used to provide sufficient security for such convoys. In the beginning, those transports were sent back to Macedon, but Alexander established several mints along his conquest, which brings us to the next part, the acquisition and construction of facilities. Alexander took over a lot of facilities from the Persian Empire, mainly the bureaucracy, the excellent road system, the good courier system, and a network of signal beacons. These facilities were crucial in Alexander's campaign, because they allowed him to efficiently coordinate reinforcements, transports, and his empire. Alexander also established new facilities, mainly by founding new cities and the construction of mints. The first and most notable city founded was Alexandria. Many more cities followed, especially in the eastern regions. These foundings may appear as basic efforts of colonization with economic and cultural motivations, but their main aim was to ensure the military dominance in the regions. Now to the final part, the furnishing of services. The three main services were the provisioning of food, medical services, and entertainment. The primary concern was, of course, the provisioning of food. Alexander was well aware of this fact, and probably for this reason he chose his routes mainly along food sources. Sometimes this led to some extensive detours, for example when crossing through Mesopotamia. Nevertheless, sometimes the lack of supplies couldn't be avoided. Little is known about the medical services in Alexander's army. We can only assume that there was something like a medical corps due to the sources mentioning the transport of medicine to India. Another indication is that ancient historians made a clear distinction between dead and wounded soldiers in their records. Entertainment was done mostly in the form of festivals with contests in athletics and horse racing, accompanied with music and other forms of entertainment. Alexander the Great is well known for his tactics, but we can assume that his capabilities concerning military logistics were also fundamental for his success on the battlefield. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment and subscribe, and see you next time.